First Presbyterian Church in Midtown Atlanta opens its mailroom for people who are homeless 4 days a week at 1 p.m. Right away, more than 20 people file into a line at the reception window.
Next.
They approach two at a time.
Hi.
I'm here to check my mail.
Inside the mailroom is a flurry of activity. 5 volunteers check IDs and search through filing cabinets stacked along the back wall. The church has about 700 people actively getting mail here. Most are homeless or living from spot to spot. A new state law says anyone can challenge another person's voting status just because their address is non-residential. On this episode, how that law could affect voters experiencing homelessness. And later, a look at how housing policy is coming up more and more on the campaign trail.
I will take on the high cost of housing and work with developers to cut the red tape and build millions of new homes.
I'm WABE Politics reporter Sam Gringlas. My colleague Raul Bally will be back next week. And this is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. We're lucky enough at WABE to have one of the top housing reporters in the country, Stephannie Stokes. She recently won a National Edward R. Murrow Award for her investigation into the displacement of Black homeowners in Metro Atlanta. Stephannie, welcome back to Plugged In.
Wow, what an intro. Thank you for having me.
So Stephannie, we've talked a few times over recent months, I think many phone calls about this law because it's something we've both been interested in tracking. Georgia Republicans passed SB 189 during the past legislative session, and it mostly deals with providing specific grounds for sustaining mass voter challenges. Remember, in Georgia, any individual can challenge the eligibility of an unlimited number of voters in their county, and those requests have numbered in the tens of thousands in recent years. Talk to me about this law, the changes related to voter challenges. What does it mean for homeless voters on your beat?
Yeah, it's definitely a confusing law, like you and I talked about. It was passed at the last minute with a compilation of different policies. And so there are different parts of the law that are going into effect at different times. So I'm going to start with the first part that went into effect this past July. And it has to do with whether or not a voter is registered at a residential address or a non-residential address. This law says that a challenge can be upheld, meaning, someone identifies a voter that they want to challenge, and that challenge can be upheld just because that voter has a non-residential address. And that's not defined any further in the law, but advocates think it will probably penalize people who don't have traditional addresses. So people who are living place to place or even in motels, or as we're talking about, people who are homeless and perhaps living in shelters or, on the street. So this is Caitlin May of the ACLU of Georgia.
There's no exception carved out for people, for example, who may be registered at a homeless shelter or somewhere else that they can actually receive mail or where they actually are sleeping at night.
So these people are especially vulnerable to voter challenges. And you certainly know that process much better than I do, but it can become a significant barrier to voting. And for people who are homeless, it can be an insurmountable barrier.
So voter challenges and cleaning voter rolls, this is something that's regularly done anyways by state and local election officials. This has become a top priority for activists who are skeptical about election integrity since the 2020 election. And just to emphasize here again, multiple audits, investigations, and recounts uncovered no evidence of widespread fraud in that election or the election since. But Stephannie, you spoke to some of the activists who supported SB 189, these new rule changes. Why did they say they were so concerned with voters who use a non-residential address?
To the people I spoke to, it was really just a no-brainer that to them, a non-residential address is just a really good indicator that someone doesn't actually live at that address. They said that it was rare that people would live, at a business or a lot that's undeveloped. So they thought that this is an easy way to help safeguard elections, because if you allow people to register at these non-traditional addresses, you open the door for people in other states registering, taking those addresses, registering to vote there, and then using using that registration to vote illegally in elections. So that was, to them, a very big plus. They didn't think that the consequences for people who are homeless that voting rights advocates were really concerned about were really that legitimate. They really downplayed them, and they said that, yeah, there might be some exceptions, but if that happens, those people can just contact their elections office or the elections officials and get that sorted out. So in their mind, the benefits of this law really outweighed the costs. And I'll just add that, state investigators have fully vetted the elections process in Georgia, and we don't know of widespread cases of people voting from illegitimate addresses.
So, Stephannie, let's go back to First Presbyterian Church. You met a voter who uses the church for election mail. Can you introduce us and explain why these non-residential addresses are so important for people like him?
Yeah, King Lyles has been living from place to place for a while. Like a lot of folks, he doesn't have one fixed address, first of all, where he can where he lives or stays at from night to night. And so he uses this church as his home base where he can get his mail. He also had Crohn's disease, so he was able to get medical supplies there. So he's already coming there for these really important things, and it's an address he knows is secure. So he registered to vote there, and that's where he goes to the precinct in the neighborhood, and it's also where he gets notifications about the elections, his precinct card, things like that. He had heard of the election law from the church leadership, and he was really unsure what it even meant for him. It really, I noticed, brought up some fear, because he said mainly that he just doesn't want to go to the polls and find that there are problems. That was something he really wanted to avoid. So I asked him about that. And what would it be like if you got there and there were problems? How would that make you feel?
Horrible, because it's like, what did you send me the card for? And you gave me hopes that I can actually vote.
So what I really heard there is that, that's a really upsetting experience to show up at the polls and find that you can't actually vote. Perhaps he would be able to vote eventually, but just that alone might discourage him from the whole process.
Yeah, and that's something we hear from voting rights activists all the time, that worry that people won't be expressly prevented from voting, but it might discourage them from casting their ballot. And it's something I've heard from potential voters too. So, Stephannie, there is another part of this law that now requires homeless voters to use their local election office for their election mail. Can you explain that real quick?
Yeah, these two parts of the law are so hard to explain together, which is why I ended up separating them into different stories. Because, first of all, this second part of the story doesn't go into effect until January of next year. So it has a different start date. And then it also has to do with something that I think a lot of voters typically don't think about, because when you're registering to vote, you can give both a address where you live, your registered address, and then you give a mailing address. For most people, those two things are going to be the same thing. So some people might not even think about the fact that you're putting a mailing address on the form, or that you could do that. So this law is going to make people who are homeless really think about that, because it says that if you are homeless, you have to put the elections office as your mailing address. Activists who are worried about election fraud say this will actually protect people who are homeless, because it protects their election mail. It allows them to pick it up at a secure place. They say a homeless shelter is not secure. And of course, one type of election mail is absentee ballots. So this allows them to make sure that they can vote securely.
So, Stephannie, when this provision was being debated at the state capitol, I immediately was thinking about Fulton County, where the election office is way south of the city of Atlanta in Fairburn. Plug that into Google Maps and you get a 21-mile drive from the city center, no public transit route. And so your only other option is a 7-hour walk.
Yeah, you pointed that out to me right before I started reporting this story. And so as I started to talk to experts, I brought this up, and I was surprised to find that no one really realized that. And these are, advocates who are focused on the voting process. So you can imagine perhaps that state legislators were not necessarily aware of that in Fulton County, where, the majority of people who are homeless might live based on the data we have. So to advocates for people who are homeless, this just, further shows that the people in charge of these decisions aren't always thinking thinking through these consequences for people at the margins. Raphael Holloway is at the Gateway Center downtown, and he made that point to me. And he's hoping that in the next legislative session, state lawmakers will include people like him and people perhaps who are homeless and unhoused, because he says otherwise we end up with these kinds of laws with these negative effects.
Why will we make it more difficult for people that are experiencing homelessness?
Yeah, and of course, a 7-hour walk or, having to pay an Uber or something to go pick up your election mail, like people who do not have housing, they're just not going to do that. So it's possible that, they wouldn't vote by absentee even if they wanted to, or that would help them vote. And it's also possible that if they did get challenged, that they would never know.
So, Stephannie, what do we know about the population of homeless voters in Metro Atlanta and how many actually participate in elections?
Well, participation is very low, and advocates for people who are homeless know this. They don't need data to tell them that. It's just when you are dealing with stress of just trying to figure out where you're going to eat and sleep, it's hard to feel engaged in these bigger issues. But I did look at the 3 main places where many people who are homeless are registered to vote. They're in the center of Atlanta. And there were a few thousand people registered to vote in those places in 2020, but only like 200 ended up showing up to the polls in the general election. So it's like less than 10%.
Voting rights groups are already talking about a federal lawsuit over these provisions. What are some of their concerns?
They argue that the law violates the National Voter Registration Act because they say it discriminates against people who are homeless. They say that, these high barriers that it imposes on people in these situations amounts to discrimination. And basically they say, what we've already talked about, that it's going to make it harder for people to participate in the elections process, to get these important types of mail from their county officials. And it's going to make these people have to jump through more hoops just to vote, and potentially it could lead them to be taken off the rolls. And Sam, there was so much hype around this law, so much concern from mainly people who are advocating for voting rights. So I am interested to hear, what has the result been so far?
So at the onset, it was not clear if this law would result in more challenges or fewer. Democrats and voting rights activists feared that codifying specific grounds for a challenge like this law did would result in more of the challenges being sustained, while Republicans said that the rules added guardrails that would cut down on all these superfluous challenges. What we do know is that Metro Atlanta election officials have again received thousands of challenges, and the majority have been dismissed. But it's not clear that there have been more this year than past election cycles. We have seen most election boards in Metro Atlanta pass new guidelines to standardize how they deal with voter challenges. For example, Cobb County is starting to charge a fee per voter challenge, like you would have to pay when you serve a lawsuit. And they have said they'll only consider challenges to active voters because inactive voters are already in the process of moving towards removal eventually. Now, activists who have focused on unsubstantiated claims of widespread fraud, who have backed SB 189, have pushed back on some of these new guidelines from local election offices, saying that they undercut the new law.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm interested to see, how this continues going forward.
Let's take a break here. You're listening to Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. Welcome back to Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. It's been really striking to me to start to hear housing come up regularly on the campaign trail. This summer, I heard it from voters like Deanna McKay, a millennial who lives in Sandy Springs, and said it's one of the most important issues to her.
So right now, it's housing, affordable housing for people that are 21 between 40 years old, to give the next generation an opportunity to have the same things that the quote-unquote baby boomers had. And I feel like my generation doesn't have that.
And we've heard it from candidates, including Vice President Kamala Harris, who mentioned housing at a recent rally in Savannah.
We fight for a future where we build what I call an opportunity economy so that every American has the opportunity to own a home, to start a business, and to build wealth and intergenerational wealth.
So, Stephannie, does it surprise you that housing is an issue that's resonating for voters and that candidates are actually picking up on that?
It does. When I started covering these issues almost 10 years ago, I never heard so much from national leaders about housing issues. It was always a very local issue, so not even bubbling up to the state level. It was very much a city by city issue. But I think, what's happening is across the country, we're seeing such similar problems crop up, rising rents, rising home prices, people really struggling. So it's become something that at the national level, these leaders have to address.
So can you zoom out super wide and talk a little bit about why housing, whether it's buying a home, finding an affordable place to rent, why this can be so challenging for people?
There are so many things. So starting with, if you're trying to be a homeowner, since the pandemic, prices, went up very fast, and they've calmed down a bit. But right at the same time as they calmed down, we saw interest rates go up, which affect the cost of a mortgage, and supply has been this problem most of the time. So during the pandemic, there were no homes on the market. So that's part of why prices got so high. But also now there's an issue where mortgage rates are high, and people who have a low mortgage rate don't want to sell their home because they don't want to end up with a higher one. So that still constrains supply. So there's all these problems in the homeownership side. And then if you're trying to be a renter, rents went up like crazy, especially 2 years ago. I talked to so many people who were seeing 20%, 50% rent increases. And of course, their wages might have, we saw some wage growth, I think, in the last few years, but nothing like that. And on top of that, we are seeing landlords impose these very strict requirements for new tenants. So they're asking for 3 times the rent. They're asking for no history of evictions in 5-10 years. And they're asking for first and last month's rent and a security deposit. It's really not only cost prohibitive, but some people who even make enough money are not able to get the housing they want. And another part of that is that with new technology, we have these huge tenant screening companies who are now available to a lot of landlords, and they're scanning all publicly available information and deciding whether or not somebody should be able to rent, an apartment. And if you're not having that problem, you might be living in a place with deteriorating housing, and we have a lot of housing stock that's decaying, that was built a few decades ago, and it's starting to really fall apart. And then beneath all of this is another phenomenon of these big corporations, these big corporate investors across the country, but especially in Atlanta, buying up homes. So they're not only potentially buying up homes that might have been available to regular residents, but they're also controlling a lot of the rental market. So there's just so many forces at play.
So let's talk about some of the proposals we're hearing from the Harris campaign. First, the idea of building 3 million new apartment units and homes, $25,000 for first-time home buyers, and ending or limiting tax breaks for those who buy multiple single-family homes. Based on your expertise, Stephannie, could these proposals help? Could they hurt? Kind of evaluate what they may mean for the housing crunch.
Sure. Yeah. Like I said, supply has been a big issue. I think everyone agrees on that. And that's definitely true in the South. I was just looking at census data this week for southern states, and we're still not building as many units as we were in 2005, so almost 20 years ago. And that was just before the housing crash. And, in Georgia and the South, we hear so much about how the population is surging, how so many people from around the country, this is like domestic migration. So many people from around the country are trying to move here. So, that's a pretty clear problem. So if you have a policy that's attacking the supply issue, I think a lot of people agree that is going to help. I do know of some experts who say that, supply, while it does help, it's not the full solution, because it's just hard to build at a price that is affordable for low-income folks. So they say, like, yes, let's work on the supply, but at the same time, we always need to be also working on creating affordable housing. And that often means getting a subsidy from the government. So that connects to this down payment assistance certainly would be, some kind of subsidy, but also subsidy for rental properties to keep those properties affordable. And this other issue you mentioned of buying multiple single-family homes, that's connecting back to these large-scale investors who have been buying properties since the last recession. They are active across the country, but Atlanta really is one of their top markets, if not their top market. Some people will say that they're a small portion of the overall housing market, but in Atlanta, they really can have a great effect because of the number of homes that they have bought here. And when I say Atlanta, I mean Metro Atlanta. So we're talking about they have a big presence in the suburbs, for example, on those suburban homes. So regulations on those type of owners, I think renters here will see an effect. So another thing that you didn't mention that has been in the Biden administration has been pushing, and I believe the Harris campaign has been continuing, is this issue of price fixing. So the Department of Justice has actually launched a lawsuit against this one company that provides rent setting software for landlords across the country, many of them in these big investors. And the Department of Justice argues that they are actually like controlling rents to keep them artificially high. So if you're attacking something like that and you're in a market where there's a lot of units that are controlled by that, then you can imagine that there would be an effect.
Georgia has also tried to address these issues at the state level with some success and some shortcomings. Legislation that passed in the last session, the Safe at Home Act, allows renters 3 days to make good on late rent, limits security deposits to double the rent, and housing must be, quote, fit for human habitation. But legislation dealing with building standards, curtailing state tax breaks for buying up housing, these did not make it through the legislature. So, Stephannie, do we have a sense whether any of these are really big enough shifts to even make a dent in this problem that is just so big?
Yeah, tenant advocates were very excited about that law passing that you talk about at the beginning, the Safe at Home Act, because the AJC found that Georgia was the only state in the country that didn't have some basic language about what kind of property landlords should be providing to tenants. The problem is that law doesn't have any teeth. It doesn't outline penalties for landlords. So tenants, from what I understand, still have to sue their landlords to get any safer conditions. And that's just a real hurdle for most people. I should say some other states allow tenants to potentially withhold rent if their landlords are not providing safe conditions. So it is, I think people see it as a really big win, but it doesn't go as far as a lot of states. But this issue of giving tenants 3 days, that is certainly significant because Georgia is one of the states where they have the fastest eviction process. So a lot of tenant advocates see any lengthening of the process as a positive for tenants. And 3 days is, typically people would not file an eviction by that point, but it prevents that, possibility, which would impose a huge hardship on tenants.
Finally, we have heard less about this issue from former President Trump and Republican campaigns. They have mentioned in their party platform, general ideas about boosting tax breaks and eliminating regulations around the construction of housing. But Stephannie, what do we know about Trump's plans here?
Well, from what I know, they have been talking about this occasionally at rallies. I remember that the vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, was talking very early on about blaming the high costs of housing on new immigrants coming to the United States and connecting to this proposal to deport millions of people around the country. So they're saying that, you're reducing the number of people seeking housing. That's going to, free up some supply. I think a lot of experts say that would not solve this this housing problem. And then, of course, there's advocates or all kinds of people that would be concerned about deporting millions of people. But on top of that, Trump has also talked about interest rates a lot, which do affect mortgage rates. I mean, interest rates are tied to mortgage rates, I should say. So lowering interest rates would certainly bring down the cost of buying a home for a lot of people. But that decision is up to the Fed, typically, not the president.
WABE housing reporter Stephannie Stokes, thank you, as always, for sharing your reporting.
Thanks. Good luck with the next few months.
And be sure to check out Stephannie's latest report on how Georgia is removing kids from their parents and charging them for their foster care. You can hear that story at wabe.org. That's all the time we've got for this edition of Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. Plugged In is a production of the WABE Politics Desk. Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick. If you appreciate this podcast, subscribe and leave us a rating. Thanks for listening.